Hello patrons, friends, Rob Caskie telling stories, and I thank you again for your ongoing support on this journey. You know, as a child growing up, and particularly as I became a young adult, I was always fascinated really with the stories of the First and the Second World War. But as I learned a little more about them, I felt ill-equipped to deal with the numbers and the scale of human slaughter involved. The numbers of dead on both sides were simply nauseating. And then a group of friends from England who come to the Anglo-Zulu War battlefields regularly managed to organize a trip to the D-Day landing beaches in Normandy in France in 2016. And we went across to those beaches. It was a harrowing visit, walking through those immaculately kept graveyards with all the graves and the gravestones symmetrically arranged, to look at the beaches and to consider what human beings had created as a means of death and destruction upon other human beings was simply staggering. But my real interest really had always been more specifically with the First World War. And a great friend called Rory Adams-Cairns, who has written this magnificent book, 20 Places to Visit on the Somme, and has been visiting the Somme for a long time, along with his delightful wife Susie and guests from England, prompted me to join him on a trip to the Somme in 2018. Now, it would be fair to say right at the outset that Karen, who's not really keen on matters of war, was more reserved than I was about visiting the Somme. And she came away saying it had been a life-changing trip for her and indeed for me. And in the Somme, in July of 1916, there was the most incredible battle that took place involving a huge number of South Africans at a place near the village of Longueval called Delville Wood. It was forever known in its history since as Devil's Wood, and appropriately so. It's a small wood, roughly a kilometre square, 64 hectares in extent, that runs off to the northeast of the village of Longueval. And that village and that little patch of forest were considered to be a major point to hold if the Allies were going to make any advance through the German lines on the Western Front. And I want to start this little talk, if I may, by reading a little excerpt about this battle that took place in July 105 years ago. During the climatic battle of the Somme, it was determined that one of the key positions held by the Germans was the small patch of land that would later become known as Delville Wood. Only 64 hectares inside, it was covered by a verdant forest where 7,000 experienced Germans had entrenched themselves. And overall command was an old veteran of the Anglo-Boer War, a man called Sir Douglas Haig, the Butcher, as his own men sometimes called him, must have remembered how tough the South Africans had been during the years when he spent his days orchestrating the burning of farms and trying in vain to catch the famous General de Wet. I don't think I need to remind you about the scorched earth policy that was instituted in this country in 1901 during the latter phases of the Anglo-Boer War. Burn the homesteads, the farms, any reserve centres, put the aged women and children in internment camps, and divide the country up into paddocks or camps with barbed wire and blockhouses, and drive the Boer men into a corner, a bit like you would a rabbit on a drive. Time for another story, another tragic part of our collective history. He selected the 1st Infantry Brigade of South Africa with a small number of Rhodesians for the tough task ahead. The force of only 3,155 men would be marching against more than 7,000 determined Germans who knew full well that to lose that forest would mean to lose the front. It would be their first major action on the Western Front for the sons of South Africa. But young men from a different world were willing to show their courage, bearing in mind that these South Africans had just come out of German Southwest Africa, where they'd been led by our great General Louis Botha, and were now shipped off to England and across the Channel into France. What a different scene in terms of the mud, the cold, the rain. The battle that followed was bloody beyond description. It lasted an entire week and up to 400 artillery shells rained down upon their small position per minute. 400 shells per minute, that's 7 shells per second. The bombardment almost never stopped as the battle waged between successive attacks and counterattacks. Over the days that followed, the small rain-drenched forest became shredded to nothing but a ploughed-over field of splintered matchsticks and fragments of red-hot steel. It would be fair to say that a huge number of the casualties sustained at Delver Wood are considered to be casualties from falling trees and branches on account of the artillery bombardment. The blood and the mud mixed with tears and slowly soaked into the unwilling clay of the French countryside. The South Africans took the forest, although in the end there was no forest left anymore. Of the forest of young men who represented the best of our nation, 2,536, more than 80%, died in that week. There were 4 dead men for every wounded. In places the bodies lay 4 deep and were so mixed with the soil that some would never be found. When they were finally recalled, the staggering survivors with their shredded limbs and uniforms could not believe their eyes. They could not even believe that they were alive, for around them it looked like the surface of the moon. Where once everything had been green and lush, nothing was left alive except for one thing, and that was a single hornbeam tree where the main memorial in Delver Wood stands today. When the war was over, General Jan Smuts and Sir Percy Fitzpatrick, the author of the famous book, Jock of the Bushveld, where I speak about Paul Kruger and the transport riders, and Jock of the Bushveld and Memories of a Game Ranger, Harry Volliter killing the lion with a knife, all tied up in this wonderful period of history. Jock of the Bushveld, famous South African book. Many think that Percy was knighted for his book. He was actually knighted for his politics and would indeed lose a son in the First World War. They wanted to preserve this ache of death as something sacred for the honour of the country. And so Fitzpatrick, who lost his own son in the war, bought the little patch of land for the Republic of South Africa. Some years later, a beautiful memorial in the shape of the Castle of the Cape would be built there. It was unveiled by the widow of General Louis Botha, Prime Minister Barry Hertzog, and Field Marshal Douglas Haig himself. So back to the Battle of Delver Wood. It would be fair to say that the battle for Longueval, the village off to the southwest of Delver Wood itself, was incredible. There were a huge number of losses on both sides. In fact, the main road through the village, when the men would later advance into Delver Wood, they said there were Germans on both sides of the road lying against the banks, stone dead. It had been taken at very heavy cost on both sides. But the Germans had cleverly entrenched themselves and set themselves up with machine gun nests and with sniping positions, and took their accurate fire against the South African forces and the Rhodesians and the Scottish who supported them very successfully. And during the night of the 14th of July of 1916, the South Africans finally advanced into the wood, breaking through the German line to the south of the wood and pushing themselves right through to the northern side of the forest with Germans all around them. And I make this point because what in effect happened was the Allied forces, largely South African, had created a balloon shape within the forest with the Germans on 3 sides of them, giving the Germans the opportunity to fire on them from 3 sides with artillery. They'd hidden snipers very cleverly in the trees. They had beautifully prepared, reinforced machine gun nests, as we call them, nests of hate. And you must remember too that the Germans from the beginning of 1915 had very cleverly and very, very professionally created very deep trenches and places. The dugouts and the trenches ran to 30 feet deep. They established 3 lanes of barbed wire in front of their trenches, 15 yards apart, 5 feet high, of treble and double thickness barbed wire. They had dugouts specially reinforced with concrete to hold 25 men at strategic positions along their trenches, and the trenches were never straight. They were always zigzag shaped, that you couldn't fire straight down a trench, and if you came around a corner there was always a chance of an enemy killing you at point blank range or booby trapping you with a hand grenade or a Mills bomb and so forth, and much of the fighting would be done with this, the famous Lee Enfield and Lee Medford bayonet. Notice the channel down each side of the blade to allow air in, that it be easier indeed to withdraw from living flesh. Try to imagine having one of these ran through your being. It would be fair to say at WW1 a huge amount of the fighting and indeed the attrition took place on the point of a German or British bayonet. Well, by morning, the Germans were pouring a very heavy fire into the Allied position. Many of the casualties, as I've already mentioned, were on account of falling trees and branches falling in upon the South African soldiers. And you must understand that in a forest, there had been some narrow rides, as we call them, narrow channels or paths through the forest that had been used for maintenance purposes and where you could walk or ride a horse. And they indeed assumed the names of famous London and Edinburgh streets as a result. So many of the reference points that you see used in describing this battle were taken from Buchanan Street, Holborn Street, Princes Street, and so forth. Now, when the South Africans managed to force their way through the German line into the wood, they immediately had to try and entrench themselves under heavy fire from German machine guns and German snipers. And of course, you want to dig yourself in as soon as possible to try and protect yourself from that fire, never mind the effect of artillery shells. But in the thick, matted roots that constituted the ground beneath those trees in Delville Wood, it was almost impossible to entrench. And as a result, the men would make small scrapes that afforded them very little cover, and the artillery shells began to create craters or huge shell holes within the forest, and the men indeed found it far easier and more convenient to take cover in a shell hole than to take cover in what they would approximate as a trench. And because of the zigzag nature of the trenches and because of the conditions within that forest, it made it almost impossible for the stretcher bearers to carry men out of those awesome conditions. It would be fair to say that in many cases, the stretcher bearers were too weak to carry a man two up. So you'd need 4 stretcher bearers carrying a stretcher, 1 on each corner. Try and imagine running down a narrow zigzag trench with the artillery shells bursting around you, being fired upon by German machine guns and the snipers, trying to carry the injured out to some makeshift stretcher and ambulance station behind the forest in the village, the northern end of the village still firmly in German hands. The men in their accounts, those who were lucky enough to survive, speak regularly of water. Water, water. They longed for fresh, cool water to drink, dying of thirst. No hot drinks or meals. They didn't want to light fires if they could on account of the rain and the wet conditions and the mud. The smoke and the fire would give away their position. And isn't it fantastic to note that on occasions the priests, the ministers, would get into the forest amongst the men and they would build a fire and boil up water despite the senior officers asking them not to, simply to afford those brave soldiers trying to hold that wood a warm drink of tea or coffee to lift their morale. How they longed for something warm to drink and something warm to eat. They talk about cold rations incessantly and a lack of water. A brave Cape-coloured sergeant ran into the trench on one occasion with a 1-gallon can of water, and as he got it to his group of soldiers, a German bullet went right through the can, and that valuable, precious water was pouring out of the can on both sides, and that sergeant fell down and cried, knowing the effort he'd made to secure them a drink, and now that precious liquid was leaking into the French clay. Well, there was a wonderful, wonderful pilot involved in the Battle of the Somme, a man by the name of Alistair McIntosh Miller, who had been born in Swaziland. He attended Sack School in Cape Town, went on from there to St. Aidan's College, then to Rhodes University, and then he studied engineering in England. He became a pilot, and I make this point because I was recently asked to do a talk at Michael House School, who lost 43 men in the First World War, many of them in the Royal Air Force. This man too was in the Royal Air Force. Do you know that St. Andrew's College, that was established earlier down in Grahamstown, lost 135 men in the First World War? But the 43 men who died as Michaelhouse Old Boys in the First World War constituted the highest proportion of lost old boys of any school in South Africa, because Michaelhouse was only established in 1894, so 1916 was only 22 years old, 24 years old by the end of the First World War. And these boys are religiously remembered on the rolls of honour at Michaelhouse and indeed on the bell tower at St Andrews. Well, he flew a little plane called a Moraine Parasol, which is very slow. It flies at about 80 miles an hour, 130 kilometers an hour. And they began to call him the Mad Major, because this pilot, Alistair McIntosh Miller, had flown regularly over Delville Wood, trying to indicate the positions of German artillery for the British artillery to try and bring their guns to bear on German artillery. And he lifted the morale incredibly of the men within the forest. He seemingly had a charmed life because he never took a hit that was enough to disable his plane. But within the southwestern corner of the forest, abutting the northern end of the village of Longueval, still firmly in German hands, was a machine gun nest that they called the Nest of Hate. And the British artillery had tried repeatedly to eliminate that machine gun nest, unsuccessfully. Well, this remarkable man, Captain Miller, said to the British artillery to take careful note of him as he took off in his little Moraine Parasol plane and took off above the forest and then began a dive onto this German machine gun nest. Do you know there were times where he pulled out 50 feet off the ground, 15 meters off the ground? The men who were watching said it was the greatest feat of daring flying they'd ever seen. He managed to limp out after these repeated dives and made an emergency landing on a field nearby, and as he brought his plane to rest, it literally fell apart. From hundreds of bullets through the wings and the fuselage of his plane, he had 4 German bullets even through his flying coat, but he had emerged uninjured. And the British artillery guns were able to bring their guns to bear on that German machine gun nest with devastating results. What a relief for the British within that forest. Well, this remarkable man became the commanding officer of the South African Air Force Base in Queenstown. And a man called Innate, who himself became a pilot and wrote a wonderful book about Delville Wood, was one day chatting to Miller, and he spoke about the Mad Major and his daring flights over Delville Wood. And Miller got a wry smile on his face, and Innate said, "There's something you're not telling me." And Miller said, "I was the pilot. I was the Mad Major who lifted morale on Delville Wood that day and indicated the position of the German Nest of Hate for the British artillery." These stories never cease to amaze me. And I want to tell you about another remarkable British officer called Charles McMorrin Wilson, a man who was born in Yorkshire. He studied medicine, became disillusioned with his lecturers. He then went and studied art in Florence in Italy. And then he cared for an aged American widow and patient on the Nile. He went back and completed his medical degree, so much so that he got the gold medal for medicine and became Churchill's personal doctor. Do you know that in 1945, McMorrin Wilson wrote a book called The Anatomy of Courage? Listen to this dedication. He said, "This book is dedicated to my father, who was without fear, by his son, who is less fortunate." This book is dedicated to my father, who was without fear, by his son, who is less fortunate. And Charles McMorrin Wilson made a distinct difference between fear and cowardice. And he was deeply affected as a medical officer on the Somme by a sergeant who was imperturbable, a man who'd been a great example to his men, who seemed without fear, incredibly brave man, and a great example to all around him, particularly the younger soldiers. And as the war went on, he became listless. He stopped taking any pride in his uniform or himself. He just sat and looked at the fire. And they gave him a break from one of the outings they were making from the trenches against the Germans. And when they got back from the sortie against the German trenches, their beloved sergeant had blown his brains out. Well, that incident stuck with Wilson for the rest of his life. And he developed a very clear understanding and belief that we have within us as human beings a credit of courage that is finite and differs between individuals. I might have a 500-pound credit of courage within my soul, for want of a better denomination. My neighbor might have a 2,000-pound credit of courage within his being. But these gruesome actions, particularly in war, are hugely expensive in terms of your courage credit. And that courage credit eventually runs out, and what became, in his own words, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. You know, they started off by talking about shell shock because a lot of the German shells were simply designed to create huge percussion or concussion and literally blew men's feet into the air, smashed eardrums, were hugely debilitating. Many men were buried alive. And if you weren't in time to shake your head to stop you being suffocated, or did not have colleagues to dig you out of being buried alive, you would succumb, being buried alive. Do you know that it's interesting to note that 7% of the inmates of prisons are ex-servicemen? That the average time for a British serviceman to seek counselling for their traumatic experiences is 14 years. And that the drain of the courage of credit in our records has been the highest in Afghanistan since World War II. And as we reflect upon these things, when I was giving the talk to these young impressionable minds at Michael House, I want to tell you the levels of engagement were extremely high. You could have heard a pin drop. And I wanted to try and impress upon those young boys the message and the notion of sacrifice. That when they walk past the Roll of Honor and see the 43 old boys' names who died in World War I, and the many who've died in subsequent actions, including World War II, they consider the courage those men made for we who enjoy life today. And that oftentimes in life, the things that are good and worthwhile do not come without sacrifice. And I reminded them of that wonderful, wonderful epitaph on the memorial at Kohima, Nagaland, northern India, where the Allied forces fought across a tennis court against the Japanese for a week. Like the song, where they fought for a week, day and night. Try and imagine the exhaustion levels of fighting day and night with 24/7 fear for your life. The exhaustion levels physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. Well, when General Lucan walked his men out of Delville Wood, there were 140 able-bodied who could walk out of the wood of the initial 3,155 who walked in. Eventually, another roughly 600 amongst the injured were accounted for. And on that memorial at Kohima, there are those beautiful words, when you get home, tell them, we gave our today for your tomorrow. We gave our today for your tomorrow. And as we reflect upon these great conflicts of humankind, I hope they never happen again. Despite what's going on in the Middle East, what's going on right now in Afghanistan, war is a terrible human scourge. For your tomorrows, we gave our today. Thank you very much.